In a world where appearances often dictate how people are treated, there are those rare moments when true character is revealed, and everyone around must face the reality of their own assumptions. This is the powerful story of Walter Johnson, a quiet World War II veteran, who encounters two arrogant young police officers at a small-town diner. They see an elderly man sitting alone, but soon discover that he is far more than meets the eye. What happens next is a reminder of the true meaning of honor, respect, and the sacrifices made by those who serve. Join us in this moving tale of courage and dignity, and witness the powerful transformation of ignorance into admiration. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and remind us of what truly matters in life. It was a crisp Wednesday morning at Martha's Diner, the kind of classic, small-town eatery where everyone knew each other. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden glow across the parking lot as patrons shuffled in for their morning coffee. Seated alone in a corner booth by the window was 78-year-old Walter Johnson, a black man whose weathered features spoke volumes of a life rich in struggle and resilience. Today, however, he appeared calm, savoring his hot coffee and quietly reading his newspaper. Walter was a World War II veteran, but very few people in town knew that. He never felt the need to flaunt his past or boast about his service. His time in the war was long ago, but the memories of battle, friendships, and sacrifices were etched into his soul. They were part of him, not for anyone else to validate, but simply a history that shaped who he was. As Walter was about to take another bite of his scrambled eggs, the door of the diner swung open with a clatter. The sudden noise made a few heads turn, and in walked two young police officers. They were both white, both confident, and both carried the kind of swagger that came with wearing a badge and a gun. Their laughter filled the room, bouncing off the walls as they sauntered over to the counter, their heavy boots thudding on the worn linoleum floor. The older of the two officers, Gary Mitchell, scanned the diner as if he owned the place. His eyes settled on Walter, who sat quietly in his booth, seemingly absorbed in his newspaper. A smirk formed at the corner of Mitchell's mouth. "Well, well, what do we have here?" he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. His partner, Brian Carter, chuckled under his breath as they both began to move towards Walter's booth. Walter glanced up, his gaze calm yet discerning. He didn't know these men personally, but he knew their type. He had seen them throughout his life, men who believed their uniforms gave them power over everyone else. Walter hoped that if he kept his eyes down and stayed quiet, they might lose interest and leave him alone. But it seemed luck was not on his side that morning. "Hey, old man," Mitchell called out again, this time standing right beside Walter's booth. His voice was thick with condescension. "You from around here, or just passing through?" Walter set down his fork with a soft clink, taking a deep breath. He looked up at the officer, his expression unreadable. "I've been around longer than you've been alive, son," Walter said evenly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that hinted at the soldier he once was. Mitchell's smirk widened into an ugly grin. "Oh, we've got a smart one here, don't we?" He turned towards Carter, who was still grinning, clearly amused by the exchange. "What do you think, Brian? Maybe he's one of those drifters, working his way through the diners looking for a handout." Carter snorted, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, could be. Why don't you show us some ID, old man? Prove you're not loitering." Walter's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he remained calm. He kept his hands resting on the table, his demeanor composed. "I don't need to show you anything," he replied quietly, his voice unwavering. Walter had faced far worse threats in his time, and he wasn't about to be bullied by two young men who knew nothing of true courage. Mitchell's grin faded, replaced by a look of irritation. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping but gaining a menacing edge. "You don't think so? I could haul you out of here right now for resisting an officer. You really want to test me, old man?" A heavy silence settled over the diner. The clatter of cutlery and low murmur of conversations had ceased, leaving only the tense exchange between Walter and the officers. The few patrons in the diner watched cautiously, their eyes shifting between Walter and the officers, unsure of what might happen next. The waitress behind the counter, a young woman named Emily, looked over anxiously, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter. No one dared to intervene. These were the town's police officers, and they wielded a power few were willing to challenge. Walter remained still, his eyes locked on Mitchell's. He had seen men like this before, men who thought a badge made them invincible. Slowly, Walter reached into his jacket pocket, moving deliberately to avoid alarming the officers. Both Mitchell and Carter tensed, their hands instinctively dropping to their holstered guns. The tension in the room was palpable, as if the very air had thickened. But instead of a weapon, Walter pulled out an old, worn leather wallet. He placed it gently on the table in front of him and pushed it toward Mitchell. The officer snatched it up, a smirk still playing on his lips as he flipped it open. But whatever smug comment he had been about to make died on his lips as his eyes widened in surprise. Inside the wallet was Walter's military ID, yellowed with age but still clearly legible. Next to it, carefully preserved, was a Distinguished Service Cross, a medal awarded for extraordinary heroism. Mitchell blinked, the color draining from his face as he realized what he was holding. This man, this elderly black man sitting quietly in a diner, was no ordinary old man. He was a war hero, a decorated veteran who had fought for the very freedoms Mitchell took for granted. The room seemed to hold its breath as Mitchell stared at the ID, his bravado crumbling. He swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance replaced by an unmistakable sense of shame. "Where did you get this?" he stammered, his voice suddenly uncertain. Walter held Mitchell's gaze, his expression calm. "I earned it," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Normandy, 1944. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Walter looked up, his eyes calm but observant. He didn't recognize these men personally, but he knew their kind, men who believed their uniforms gave them power over anyone and everyone. Walter shifted his gaze back to his breakfast, hoping they would lose interest and leave him alone. But that was wishful thinking. "Hey, old man," Mitchell called out again, leaning over Walter's booth. His voice was laced with condescension. "You from around here, or just passing through?" Walter sighed inwardly, setting down his fork. He looked up at the officer, his face unreadable. "I've been here longer than you've been alive, son," he said evenly, his voice steady, carrying a quiet dignity that hinted at the soldier he once was. Mitchell's face hardened, his sneer widening. "Well, isn't that cute?" The old guy's got a smart mouth. He turned to Carter, who was still chuckling. "What do you think, Brian? Maybe he's one of those vagrants, working his way through the diners looking for handouts." Carter laughed, nodding. "Yeah, probably. Why don't you show us some ID, old man? Prove you're not loitering." Walter's jaw tightened, but he stayed seated, his hands resting on the table. "I don't need to show you anything," he said quietly, refusing to be intimidated. Mitchell's grin faded, replaced by a look of irritation. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping but gaining a menacing edge. "You don't think so? I could haul you out of here right now for resisting an officer. You really want to test me, old man?" The diner fell silent. Conversation ceased, and all eyes turned towards the unfolding confrontation. The patrons watched nervously, unsure of what would happen next. The waitress behind the counter, Emily, held her breath, her eyes darting towards Walter, then back to the officers. She wanted to say something, but fear kept her rooted in place. Walter remained calm, his eyes never leaving Mitchell's. He had faced far worse during his time in the war, and he wasn't about to be bullied by a young man who had never seen true hardship. He had looked death in the face more times than he could count. This was nothing compared to that. Slowly, Walter reached into his jacket pocket. The movement was deliberate, his gaze never breaking from Mitchell's. The officers tensed, their hands hovering near their holstered guns. A few patrons gasped, fearing the worst. But Walter wasn't reaching for a weapon. Instead, he pulled out an old worn leather wallet and placed it on the table, pushing it towards Mitchell. Mitchell snatched the wallet up, still sneering as he flipped it open. But whatever smug comment he had on the tip of his tongue died as soon as his eyes landed on the contents. His expression shifted from arrogance to confusion, then shock. Inside the wallet was a military ID, yellowed with age but unmistakable. Next to it was a Distinguished Service Cross, its ribbon slightly frayed but still vibrant. Mitchell blinked, his bravado faltering. He swallowed hard, glancing over at Carter, who had also leaned in to see what was inside the wallet. Carter's eyes widened, and the grin slipped from his face. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "Where did you get this?" Mitchell stammered, his voice losing its earlier edge. Walter's eyes were steady, his expression calm. "I earned it," he said simply. "Normandy, 1944. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Mitchell's face turned pale, and his mouth opened, but no words came out. The arrogance that had been so evident moments before had vanished. He glanced down at the wallet again, his fingers trembling as he carefully closed it. He handed it back to Walter, his eyes avoiding the older man's gaze. I didn't know," Mitchell mumbled, his voice barely audible. The diner remained silent, every patron watching the scene unfold with bated breath. Walter took the wallet, tucking it back into his jacket without a word. He had nothing to prove to these men. The respect he had earned was not something that could be diminished by a couple of arrogant officers. He had fought for his country, for their freedom, and he didn't need their validation. Carter, who had been standing silently, now shifted uncomfortably. He cleared his throat, his face flushed. "Look, we didn't mean any disrespect," he said, his voice lacking the earlier bravado. "We were just doing our job." Walter looked at Carter, his expression softening just a fraction. "Your job, son, is to protect and serve, not to intimidate those who mean no harm," he said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Remember that." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mitchell and Carter exchanged a glance, both of them clearly uncomfortable. The smugness had drained from their faces, replaced by something closer to shame. They were young, and they had made a mistake that had just been laid bare for everyone in the diner to see. Emily, the waitress, finally gathered the courage to step forward. Her voice was shaky as she spoke up. "Mr. Johnson, can I get you anything else?" she asked, her eyes filled with respect. Walter looked up at her, a gentle smile forming on his lips. "No, thank you, Emily. I think I've had enough for today." He nodded to her, then slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and steady. The room remained silent, the patrons watching as Walter gathered his things. The officers stepped back, giving him space. They looked down, avoiding his gaze as he walked past them. Walter paused at the counter, nodding once more to Emily before making his way to the door. The quiet strength he exuded spoke louder than any words could. As Walter pushed open the door and stepped out into the morning sunlight, a few patrons began to murmur among themselves. The officers remained rooted in place, the reality of their actions sinking in. They had come in with arrogance, but they were leaving with a lesson in humility, respect, and the true meaning of service. Walter walked across the parking lot, the sun casting a warm glow on his figure. He had faced battles far greater than this, and he knew that the fight for respect and dignity was never truly over. But today, he had made a stand, and that was enough. With each step, he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he had, once again, shown what true courage looked like. Mitchell's face twisted in irritation. "You don't think so? We could haul you out of here right now for resisting an officer. You really want to test me?" A heavy silence settled over the diner. The few other patrons turned their attention to the unfolding confrontation, their expressions wary. The waitress behind the counter bit her lip, clearly uncomfortable, but she remained rooted in place. After all, who would stand up to the police? Walter didn't flinch. He had faced far worse than this. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket. Both officers stiffened, their hands instinctively moving towards their holstered guns. But instead of a weapon, Walter pulled out an old, worn leather wallet. He placed it on the table, pushing it towards Mitchell. Mitchell, a smirk still on his face, grabbed the wallet and flipped it open. But whatever smug comment he had on the tip of his tongue died as soon as his eyes landed on the contents. His expression shifted from arrogance to confusion, then shock. Inside the wallet was Walter's military ID, faded but still legible, alongside a meticulously preserved Distinguished Service Cross, a symbol of bravery in the face of mortal danger, the second highest military honor awarded in the United States. Mitchell's eyes widened as he looked at the ID and the medal, the color draining from his face. He blinked, the confidence he had just displayed now replaced by uncertainty. He swallowed hard, glancing over at Carter, who had moved closer to get a look at the wallet. Carter's smirk quickly faded, replaced by a look of disbelief. "Where did you get this?" Mitchell stammered, his voice losing its earlier edge. He stared at the medal, unable to process what he was seeing. Walter's gaze remained steady, his face calm. "I earned it," he said simply. in a place called Normandy, 1944. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son? Mitchell's mouth opened, but no words came out. The arrogance that had been so evident moments before had vanished, replaced by a creeping sense of shame. He looked down at the wallet again, his fingers trembling slightly as he carefully closed it and handed it back to Walter. I didn't know, he mumbled, his eyes no longer meeting Walter's. Walter took the wallet and tucked it back into his jacket without a word. He didn't need their apology. Their ignorance had already said enough. The few patrons in the diner watched in silence, their expressions ranging from shock to admiration. The waitress, Emily, let out a shaky breath, her eyes welling with tears as she realized the magnitude of the moment. Carter cleared his throat, trying to regain some semblance of authority. "Look, sir, we were just doing our job," he said, though his voice lacked the bravado it had carried earlier. "We didn't mean any disrespect." Walter looked up at Carter, his expression softening slightly. "Your job," he said, his voice calm but firm, "is to protect and serve, not to intimidate those who mean no harm." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of experience and the authority of someone who had truly served his country. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his face flushed with embarrassment. He glanced around the diner, noticing the disapproving looks from the patrons. The realization that they had made a mistake, a serious one, was beginning to sink in. He looked back at Walter, the older man's calm demeanor only adding to his shame. "We're sorry," Mitchell finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked down, unable to meet Walter's eyes. Carter nodded in agreement, his face equally flushed. Walter nodded slowly, acknowledging the apology but not dwelling on it. He knew that words were cheap, it was actions that mattered. He looked at the two officers, his gaze steady. "Just remember, respect is something you give, not something you take," he said. "And it doesn't come from a badge." The tension in the diner began to dissipate as Walter's words sank in. The officers, humbled and visibly shaken, stepped back, giving Walter space. Walter slowly stood up, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He picked up his newspaper, folding it neatly before placing it under his arm. He took a deep breath, then nodded once to Emily, who gave him a small, tearful smile. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," Emily said softly, her voice filled with respect. Walter gave her a gentle nod, then turned his attention back to the officers. "Take care, boys," Walter said, his tone neither harsh nor forgiving, but simply matter-of-fact. He had seen enough of life to know that everyone had lessons to learn, some harder than others. Walter made his way towards the diner's door, the room still unusually quiet. The patrons watched him, many with newfound admiration. He had stood his ground with dignity and grace, showing true courage without raising his voice or resorting to threats. He was a living testament to the kind of bravery that came not from a uniform, but from character and experience. As Walter pushed open the door and stepped outside, the morning sunlight bathed him in a warm glow. He paused for a moment, taking in the fresh air, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He glanced back through the window of the diner, seeing the officers still standing there, their heads bowed slightly, lost in thought. Walter hoped that this moment would stay with them, that they would remember what real service and sacrifice looked like. He walked across the parking lot towards his old truck, each step filled with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced true adversity and come out stronger. The other patrons slowly returned to their breakfasts, the hum of conversation gradually picking up again, though the atmosphere in the diner had undoubtedly changed. Walter had left behind more than just a memory. He had left behind a lesson. As Walter climbed into his truck, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. He had no need for recognition or praise. What mattered most to him was knowing that he had lived his life with integrity, that he had faced down the ugliness of the world without losing himself. He started the engine, the rumble of the old truck breaking the silence of the parking lot. With a final glance back at Martha's diner, Walter drove away, leaving behind a quiet but powerful reminder of what true honor looked like. It wasn't about medals or uniforms. It was about standing up for what was right, even when no one else would. And that was a lesson worth teaching, one person at a time. Mitchell blinked, his bravado faltering. The blood drained from his face as realization hit him. This was no ordinary old man. This was a war hero, a decorated veteran who had served his country with courage that far exceeded anything Mitchell could comprehend. "Where did you get this?" Mitchell stammered, his voice cracking. Walter held Mitchell's gaze, his expression unchanging. "I earned it," he said quietly. "In a place called Normandy, 1944. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Mitchell swallowed hard, his arrogance replaced by a creeping sense of shame. Carter, now pale and visibly uncomfortable, shifted his weight, looking down at the floor as if it might swallow him whole. Walter didn't move. He didn't need to. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the diner could feel it. The officers who had swaggered in, thinking they could bully an old man, now stood stripped of their authority. In the face of true honor and sacrifice, their badges seemed meaningless. Mitchell handed the wallet back, his hand trembling slightly. We didn't know," he mumbled, his eyes no longer meeting Walter's. I'm sorry." Walter took the wallet without a word, tucking it back into his jacket. He glanced up at the officers, his gaze steady and unwavering. "Sorry doesn't mean much unless you learn something from it," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Remember, respect is earned, not given just because you wear a uniform." Mitchell nodded, swallowing his pride as the weight of Walter's words sank in. Carter, too, seemed to deflate, his earlier bravado evaporating. The two officers exchanged a glance, both clearly shaken by the turn of events. They had thought they were in control, but it was now painfully evident that they had underestimated the man in front of them. The tension in the diner began to slowly dissipate, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Emily, the waitress, finally gathered the courage to step forward. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of awe and respect as she looked at Walter. "Mr. Johnson, can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice soft, almost reverent. Walter turned his head toward her and smiled gently. "No, thank you, Emily. I think I'm done here," he said, his voice carrying a sense of finality. He slowly stood up, the years of his life evident in the deliberate way he moved, yet there was still a quiet strength in his posture. As Walter gathered his belongings, the other patrons watched in silence. Some had tears in their eyes, others simply looked humbled. They had witnessed something profound, an unassuming man standing tall against intimidation, proving that true courage comes from within, not from authority or power. Mitchell and Carter stepped back, giving Walter the space he deserved. Both officers stood with their heads slightly bowed, their earlier arrogance nowhere to be seen. Walter turned to them one last time, his gaze piercing but not unkind. "You boys have a good day now," he said, his tone neither forgiving nor hostile, but simply stating a truth. With that, Walter walked toward the door, his steps deliberate and unhurried. He pushed the door open, the bell above it chiming softly as he stepped out into the morning sunlight. He paused for a moment, letting the warm rays wash over him, and took a deep breath. The fresh air filled his lungs, and he felt a sense of peace, knowing that he had once again stood his ground. Inside the diner, the patrons began to murmur amongst themselves. The officers remained where they were, still processing what had just happened. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek, a small smile tugging at her lips as she watched Walter disappear from view. "That man is a true hero," she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with emotion. The other patrons nodded in agreement, their expressions reflecting the same sentiment. They had all just witnessed something that would stay with them for a long time, a moment of true bravery and dignity that transcended the everyday hustle of their small town. Walter walked across the parking lot to his old truck, the metal glinting in the sunlight. He reached out, opening the door and climbing inside. He took a moment to sit quietly, his hands resting on the worn steering wheel. He thought about the officers, the confrontation, and the way the diner had gone silent as the truth of who he was had come to light. He wasn't angry. He had faced too much in his life to harbor anger for long. He was just tired. Tired of the assumptions, tired of the disrespect. He started the engine, the rumble of the truck breaking the quiet of the parking lot. Walter glanced back at the diner, seeing the faces of the people inside looking out at him. He gave a small nod, as if to acknowledge their silent support, and then turned his gaze forward. As he drove away, Walter felt a sense of calm wash over him. He knew he had made an impact, not just on the officers, but on everyone who had witnessed the exchange. He had reminded them all that dignity cannot be taken away by threats or intimidation, and that real power comes from standing up for oneself with grace and courage. The road stretched out before him, the sun climbing higher in the sky. Walter knew that his fight wasn't over, It never truly was. There would always be people who judged based on appearances, who thought their authority gave them the right to demean others. But Walter also knew that there would always be opportunities to teach, to stand tall, and to remind others of what real honor looked like. He smiled to himself, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. Today had been a good day. He had faced down ignorance and come out on the other side with his dignity intact. And as long as he could keep doing that, he knew he was living a life worth living. Walter took the wallet and tucked it back into his jacket without a word. He didn't need their apology. Their ignorance had already said enough. The two officers, now thoroughly humiliated, turned and walked out of the diner, their shoulders slumped, their swagger gone. The door closed behind them with a hollow clatter, leaving an awkward silence in their wake. The waitress, who had watched the entire exchange, finally mustered the courage to approach Walter's booth. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Johnson?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a newfound respect. Walter gave her a gentle smile and shook his head. "No, thank you. I think I'm done here." As Walter stood to leave, the other patrons watched him, their expressions filled with admiration. Some of them nodded respectfully, and a few whispered amongst themselves. Walter could feel the shift in the atmosphere, a newfound reverence that hadn't been there before. He wasn't looking for recognition or thanks. He never had been. All he wanted was what every veteran deserved, respect and dignity. He took his time gathering his belongings, placing his hat carefully on his head and slipping his worn coat over his shoulders. The years had not been kind to Walter's body, but he moved with a certain grace, each deliberate motion speaking of the strength that still lived within him. He turned to leave, and as he did, a voice called out from the other side of the diner. "Thank you for your service, sir," a young man said, his voice earnest. He looked no older than 20, his eyes wide with admiration. Walter paused, giving the young man a nod and a small smile. "You're welcome, son," he replied, his voice warm. Walter slowly made his way to the door, and as he pushed it open, the bell above it gave a soft chime. He stepped out into the bright morning sun, the light momentarily blinding him. He took a deep breath, savoring the crisp air that filled his lungs. The past few minutes had brought up memories of times when he had fought for not only his country but also for the respect of his fellow men. Those battles had left their marks, but they had also shaped him into the man he was today. Walter walked across the parking lot towards his old truck, the gravel crunching beneath his worn boots. The sun warmed his face, and he could hear the distant chirping of birds in the trees. There was a sense of calm that came over him, a feeling of peace that he cherished. He knew the world wasn't perfect, but he also knew that small moments of courage could make a difference, even if only for a few people at a time. He reached his truck, pausing to run a hand along the faded paint. The old vehicle had been with him for years, a reminder of a simpler time when life was about hard work and family. Walter climbed in, settling into the familiar seat. He looked back towards the diner, where he could see the patrons still watching him from inside. He nodded once more, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, before starting the engine. The truck roared to life, the sound echoing through the lot. Walter put it in gear and slowly pulled out, the tires crunching over the gravel as he drove away. He felt the weight of what had just happened, not in a heavy, burdensome way, but as a reminder of the importance of standing up for oneself, no matter the cost. As Walter drove down the main road, he couldn't help but reflect on the young officers. He hoped they had learned something from their encounter, something that would stay with them as they continued their work. Respect wasn't something that could be demanded, it had to be earned, and it had to be given freely. Walter knew that from experience, from all the battles he had fought both overseas and at home. The road stretched out ahead of him, winding through the town he had called home for so many years. Walter passed familiar sights, the old hardware store, the barber shop, the school where his children had once played. The town had changed over the years, but the core of it remained the same. It was a place where people knew each other, where stories were shared over coffee, and where respect was earned one action at a time. Walter turned onto a quiet street lined with tall oak trees, their branches forming a canopy overhead. He drove slowly, taking in the scenery, the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. As he approached his house, he felt a sense of contentment. The small, modest home stood just as it always had, a place of comfort and memories. He parked the truck in the driveway and turned off the engine, sitting for a moment in the stillness. Walter knew that he had made a difference today, even if it was just a small one. He had reminded those officers, and everyone in the diner, that dignity and courage were not things that could be taken away by force. They were earned through a lifetime of actions, through standing tall even when the world tried to push you down. Walter climbed out of the truck, his knees protesting slightly as he did so. He walked up the steps to his front porch, the wood creaking under his weight. He paused at the door, looking out at the quiet street. Life wasn't always easy, but it was moments like these, moments where he could stand tall and be true to himself, that made it all worthwhile. He opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of home greeting him. Walter hung his hat on the hook by the door and shrugged off his coat, placing it over the back of a chair. He moved to the window, looking out at the street, watching as a few children rode their bikes down the sidewalk, their laughter echoing in the air. A small smile formed on Walter's lips as he watched them. The world still had its beauty, its innocence, and its moments of light. And as long as there were people willing to stand up for what was right, willing to treat others with respect and dignity, there was hope. Walter knew that he wasn't done fighting, not yet. But for now, he was content to rest, knowing that today, he had made a difference. Outside, the sun had fully risen, bathing the street in warmth. Walter stepped out of the diner, his head held high. He had won a battle that day, not with violence or anger, but with the quiet strength that had always defined him. The two officers were now huddled near their patrol car, avoiding his gaze. Walter wasn't angry. More than anything, he was tired. Tired of the same old stories repeating themselves. Tired of people making assumptions just because of the color of his skin or the lines on his face. But today had been different. Today, the truth had been laid bare in a way that no one could ignore. As Walter walked towards his car, a few patrons hurried out of the diner, calling after him to express their gratitude, some for his service, others for the dignity with which he carried himself. He nodded politely, accepting their words, though he knew the real work wasn't in these small gestures. It was in changing minds, one encounter at a time. He climbed into his old truck, started the engine, and looked back at the diner. A small, satisfied smile crossed his face. They hadn't known who he was at first, but they knew now. And with that, Walter Johnson drove away, leaving behind a lesson that would echo in that small town long after he was gone. True honor, he knew, wasn't about medals or uniforms. It was about integrity, sacrifice, and the quiet courage to stand tall in the face of adversity. As Walter drove through the town, he passed familiar landmarks, places that held memories of his younger days. The hardware store where he used to buy supplies, the barber shop where he'd share stories with old friends, the park where his children used to play. Each sight brought back vivid memories, both good and bad, but all part of the life he had lived. He knew every corner of this town, and despite its flaws, it was home. Walter pulled onto a narrow street lined with maple trees, their branches creating an archway over the road. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across the pavement. As he drove slowly, he saw his neighbors outside, some tending to their gardens, others chatting over white picket fences. A few of them waved at Walter as he passed, and he nodded in return, appreciating the sense of community that had always been a part of this place. He eventually reached his driveway, the small, modest house standing just as it always had. The paint was starting to peel in places, and the porch steps creaked, but it was his sanctuary. Walter parked the truck, turning off the engine and sitting in the quiet for a moment. The events at the diner played over in his mind, the arrogance of the officers, the fear in the eyes of the patrons, and then the shift that had come when they realized who he truly was. Walter opened the door and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his boots as he made his way to the front porch. He climbed the steps, pausing to take in the view of the quiet street. The air was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers, a reminder of the simple beauty that still existed in the world. He reached for the door handle, but before he could open it, he heard a voice calling out. "Mr. Johnson," a young voice rang out. Walter turned, seeing a boy from down the street running up the walkway. It was Tommy, a neighborhood kid who often helped him with small chores. Tommy skidded to a stop, his face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Johnson, my dad told me what happened at the diner. He said you were amazing." Walter smiled gently, crouching down slightly to be at eye level with the boy. "Did he now?" "Well, I just did what anyone should do, Tommy. Sometimes you have to stand up for yourself and for others, even when it's hard." Tommy's eyes widened, and he nodded solemnly. "My dad said you're a real hero," he said, his voice filled with admiration. Walter's smile softened. "A hero is just someone who does the right thing when it needs doing, son. You remember that, okay?" Tommy nodded eagerly, a determined look on his face. "I will, Mr. Johnson." With that, he turned and dashed back down the walkway, waving as he went. Walter watched him go, a sense of hope swelling in his chest. Maybe the world could be better if the next generation learned the right lessons early on. Walter finally opened his front door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of home wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. He hung his hat on the hook by the door and shrugged off his coat, draping it over the back of a chair. He moved to the window, looking out at the street, watching as the neighborhood went about its day. He knew that what had happened at the diner wouldn't change the world overnight. There would still be those who judged others based on their appearance, those who let power cloud their judgment. But Walter also knew that every small stand made a difference. Every moment of courage planted a seed, and one day, maybe those seeds would grow into something greater. Walter walked to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the room. He took a seat at the small table by the window, the sunlight streaming in and warming his face. He thought about the young officers, Mitchell and Carter. He hoped they had learned something valuable that day, something that would stay with them as they continued to wear their badges. It wasn't too late for them to become the kind of officers the community truly needed. As he sipped his coffee, Walter allowed himself to relax. He had done his part for today, and that was enough. The fight for respect and dignity was ongoing, but he had the strength for it. He had faced battles far worse, and he had come out the other side each time with his head held high. The sound of children playing outside drifted through the open window, their laughter a reminder of the innocence that still existed in the world. Walter smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. Today had been a good day, a day where he had once again stood up for what was right, where he had shown that true strength came not from power, but from integrity. He knew that there would be more battles ahead, but for now, he was content to sit in the warmth of his kitchen, the sunlight on his face, and the knowledge that he had made a difference, even if it was just a small one. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the quiet, the simplicity, and the knowledge that, no matter what came next, he would face it with the same quiet strength that had defined him all his life. Walter Johnson's story is a powerful reminder that true honor and respect are earned through actions, not appearances. In a world that often judges based on first impressions, Walter's quiet courage and dignity teach us that real strength lies in standing up for oneself without losing composure. The officers learned a valuable lesson that day. Authority comes with responsibility, and respect is something that must be given to be received. Let this story inspire us all to look beyond the surface and treat every individual with the respect they deserve, regardless of their age, race, or appearance.